I am Victor, and I am 32 years old. After 3 long, grueling years of marriage, my in-laws orchestrated a brutal ambush. They invited me to a traditional Thanksgiving dinner, only to slide a 14-page postnuptial agreement across the table. It was a legally binding document meticulously designed by an expensive family lawyer to strip me of absolutely everything, force me to waive any right to my own marriage, and throw me out on the cold street with nothing but the clothes on my back. While I was sitting there at that massive, obscenely expensive dining table, staring at a legal document meant to erase my entire existence, my mother-in-law Beatrice looked dead into my eyes. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at me with pure, unadulterated disgust and said that my dead mother raised a man who looks for shortcuts in life. She ordered me to sign the paper and called me a parasite. They sat there and laughed at me in front of the entire family. They were absolutely convinced they had trapped a penniless, desperate gold digger who was leeching off their massive commercial real estate fortune. They thought they had finally put me in my place. But there was one massive, world-shattering thing they did not know. They had absolutely no idea about the $2.1 billion tech empire I had built entirely from the ground up with my own 2 hands. They had no idea that I had just quietly and methodically acquired the massive commercial bank that was currently holding the overdue, defaulting mortgage to their entire family estate. And right now, as I tell you this story, my arrogant, sneering brother-in-law is sitting in a federal prison cell wearing a bright orange jumpsuit. Before I tell you exactly what happened in that dining room and how I systematically dismantled their fake, arrogant reality piece by piece, hit that like button if you truly believe in justice. And do not forget to let me know exactly where you are watching from down in the comments section below. I read every single one of them. Now, let us go back to the exact moment the trap was sprung. The formal dining room in the Holloway estate up in Connecticut was a room built for intimidation. It was easily 20 feet long, a cavernous space with high vaulted ceilings and dark mahogany walls lined with old, imposing portraits of Holloway ancestors. The dining table itself was a massive slab of custom-crafted oak, covered in a crisp, blindingly white linen tablecloth that probably cost more than my very first car. The table was set with heavy sterling silver cutlery, imported porcelain plates with gold rims, and thick crystal glasses that caught and fractured the warm light pouring down from a massive, glittering chandelier hanging directly above us. The smell of roasted turkey, rich sage stuffing, sweet cranberry sauce, and expensive floor wax was heavy and thick in the air. It was Thanksgiving. It was supposed to be a day of immense gratitude, a warm family gathering to share a meal and give thanks. But absolutely nobody was eating. The ornate silver serving platters sat completely untouched, the steam slowly rising and vanishing into the cold air of the room. I was seated near the middle of the long table. I sat directly across from my brother-in-law, Julian. Julian was the ultimate golden boy of the family. He was the one with the expensive Ivy League degree, the perfectly styled hair that never moved out of place, and a high-level, high-paying job in corporate wealth management. He wore a custom-tailored, dark navy suit to a family Thanksgiving dinner just to make a point about his status. My father-in-law, Richard, sat at the head of the table like a medieval king holding court. Richard had made his massive fortune in commercial real estate over the last 4 decades. He was a broad, imposing man with silver hair and a thick neck. He carried himself with the absolute, unshakable certainty of a man who had never been told the word no in his entire privileged life. Beatrice, my mother-in-law, anchored the completely opposite end of the long table. She was wearing a tailored designer wool dress and enough heavy diamond jewelry to blind anyone who looked directly at her. There was a 6th man at the table, sitting quietly and observing everything to Richard's immediate right. His name was Gregory. He was the family's senior financial advisor and occasionally their private, highly paid lawyer for very sensitive, quiet family matters. He was a legal mercenary in a sharp gray suit. He was the one who reached down into his expensive leather briefcase, pulled out a thick, heavy stack of cream-colored stock paper, and slid it precisely across the white linen. I watched the document glide smoothly across the table. It made a soft, abrasive, sliding sound against the fabric before stopping right next to my pristine porcelain plate. I looked down at the paper. The title was typed in bold, aggressive, undeniable black letters. Postnuptial asset protection and waiver agreement. I stared at those words for a long, heavy, agonizing second. My brain was actively trying to process what my eyes were seeing. Postnup. 3 entire years into our marriage. I slowly lifted my head and looked directly up at Richard at the head of the table. I asked him in a perfectly calm voice what this was supposed to be. The silence that followed in that room was absolute and terrifying. You could clearly hear the heavy brass pendulum of the antique grandfather clock ticking out in the main hallway. Beatrice slowly folded her manicured hands neatly in her lap. She had spent 60 years of her life perfecting the specific kind of cold, calculated calm that made you feel the floor shifting and cracking beneath your feet. She never raised her voice because she never needed to. True power in her world was always spoken in a whisper. She looked at me and told me it was exactly what it looked like. She called it a necessary safeguard for her family's legacy. She looked at me with cold, dead gray eyes and promised me that if I did not pick up the pen and sign it before dessert was served, Richard would have his ruthless legal team file the annulment and divorce papers by Monday morning. She said it so casually, so effortlessly, like she was asking someone to simply pass the salt across the table. I looked back down at the document. 14 dense pages. I could clearly see the aggressive legal jargon printed on the very first page. It was meticulously designed to strip me of every single marital asset we had acquired. It demanded I waive any right to a fair, equitable divorce settlement. It demanded I waive any claim whatsoever to spousal support. It was structured to ensure I walked away with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back. They even had a specific, cruel clause regarding future custody, ensuring I would never be able to claim a single dime of their money for child support if Clara and I ever had children. They had intentionally placed a heavy, expensive silver pen right next to the paper, laying it out like a piece of dining silverware. I slowly turned my head to my right to look at my wife, Clara. I fully expected to see absolute shock and horror on her face. I expected her to stand up abruptly, to yell at her controlling parents, to grab my hand tightly and tell me we were leaving this toxic house immediately. I waited patiently for the woman I married, the woman I loved, to defend our life together. But she did not move a single muscle. She was staring straight down at her lap. Her face was completely pale, entirely drained of color. Her hands were trembling violently as they gripped her white cloth napkin. I whispered her name softly. I searched her face for any sign of fight, any spark of loyalty. She swallowed hard, completely refusing to meet my eyes. She leaned in closer to my shoulder, her voice shaking with fear. She told me to just do what they asked. She said it was just a formality, just a stupid piece of paper to make her parents feel secure about the inheritance. She actively begged me not to fight them. She promised it would not change anything real between us. Across from me, Julian let out a low, mocking, cruel chuckle. He leaned back in his expensive dining chair, slowly swirling his red wine in his crystal glass. He told me to stop looking at my wife like a lost puppy and look at the paper. He said it was finally time to face the music and pay the toll for living in their world. I sat perfectly still. The sheer betrayal burned the back of my throat like cheap, toxic whiskey. My own wife, the woman I had sworn to protect with my life, the woman I loved deeply, was happily throwing me to the wolves just to save herself from her father's wrath. She would much rather watch me be publicly humiliated and legally stripped of my dignity than stand up to her family. Julian was smirking, thoroughly enjoying every single second of my perceived misery. Richard looked incredibly triumphant, his chest puffed out with pride. Beatrice looked at me like I was a cockroach that had finally been cornered by the exterminator. They truly thought they had won the war. They thought they were the apex predators and I was the weak, helpless prey. They looked at my modest blue suit, my quiet demeanor, and they saw a victim they could easily crush. But before I tell you exactly what I calmly pulled out of my own briefcase to place on that immaculate white tablecloth, you need to deeply understand how we ended up playing this twisted, sick game of financial Russian roulette. You need to understand exactly who I really am, where I actually came from, and why I let them believe their own arrogant lies for 3 long, painful years. I thought the worst part of my life was already over. I was so incredibly wrong. The Holloway family looked at me and saw a convenient category, not a living, breathing human being. They saw my humble background, my severe lack of social pedigree, and they made their instant, permanent assumptions. I was certainly not born into a family with a heavy last name that magically opened heavy oak doors. I did not have a massive trust fund sitting in an offshore account, or a fully funded college fund waiting for me when I turned 18. I did not grow up going to exclusive country clubs, playing tennis, or spending my summers lounging in the Hamptons. I grew up in a cramped, dark, two-bedroom apartment in Akron, Ohio. It was the specific kind of rough neighborhood where you locked your thin doors twice every night and the ancient heater sounded like a dying car engine all winter long. If the apartment furnace broke down in the middle of January, which it often did, you slept in your heavy winter coat, layered under 3 thin, scratchy blankets, and you prayed for an early spring. My father walked out on us when I was barely 4 years old. I do not remember much about him at all. Just the loud, violent sound of the front door slamming shut and the loud, ringing, terrifying silence that immediately followed in the apartment. From that day forward, it was just me and my mother, Sylvia. My mother worked grueling double shifts at a local, run-down diner just off the highway. She spent her days and nights carrying heavy, greasy trays of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and endless glass pots of boiling black coffee until her feet swelled to twice their size and her lower back ached constantly. I vividly remember sitting at our tiny, scratched, wobbly kitchen table late at night. I would be trying to do my middle school math homework under a flickering, buzzing overhead light bulb while she sat directly across from me. She would rub her aching temples, exhausted down to her very bones, and meticulously count the wrinkled dollar bills and sticky quarters from her tip jar. She was constantly trying to figure out if we could actually afford fresh vegetables from the supermarket that week, or if we were eating cheap canned beans for the 4th night in a row. She did not have a massive stock portfolio to rely on. She did not have a sprawling real estate inheritance to pass down to me. But what she had was absolute, unbreakable, fierce grit. She taught me early on that absolutely nobody in this world owes you a single thing. You earn your keep with your own 2 hands, your sweat, and your brain. You respect people no matter what their job title is or how much money they make. And most importantly, you never, ever let anyone make you feel small just because your pockets happen to be empty. When I was 21 years old, she got sick. Really, truly sick. It was the specific kind of brutal illness that rapidly drains whatever tiny, pathetic savings you have managed to scrape together and leaves you with absolutely nothing but towering, insurmountable medical bills and deep, suffocating despair. I was a junior in college at the time, studying advanced computer science on a partial academic scholarship, and working 2 exhausting part-time jobs just to cover my share of the rent and cheap groceries. I dropped absolutely everything to take care of her. I slept in the uncomfortable, stiff plastic chairs in her sterile hospital room for weeks. I watched the strongest, bravest woman I ever knew slowly fade away into nothing. And despite everything I did, despite every extra shift I worked to pay for treatments, it was not enough to save her. I will never, ever forget the terrible day of her funeral. It was pouring rain, a cold, bitter, relentless Ohio downpour. There were only 6 people in attendance, mostly her old, tired coworkers from the diner, women who looked just as exhausted as she used to. I stood by her open grave in a cheap, ill-fitting black suit I had bought at a local thrift store for $20. The freezing rain soaked right through the thin fabric of my worn-out dress shoes. I stood there shivering violently in the mud, looking down at the cheap, standard headstone we could barely afford to engrave. And right there, standing in the freezing rain, I made a silent, unbreakable promise to her. I promised her I would build something real, something massive, lasting, and completely indestructible. I promised that I would never be helpless again, that I would never have to watch someone I love suffer and die simply because I did not have the money to save them. And I promised I would never let anyone look down on the blood, sweat, and tears she had poured into raising me. After the funeral, I did not go back to working regular, dead-end jobs. I walked into a dark, cramped, windowless computer lab at the university, and I started coding. I had a complex idea for data routing and security protocols that I knew deep in my bones could revolutionize the entire financial sector. I founded Veer Systems when I was exactly 24 years old. I did not have fancy venture capital backing. I did not have rich friends to invest in my risky startup. I built the entire back-end infrastructure out of a rented, unheated garage for 3 solid, agonizing years. I lived on a salary of absolutely zero. Every single penny I managed to make from small consulting gigs went straight back into buying better servers, cooling systems, and paying for massive amounts of bandwidth. I ate cheap instant ramen noodles every single day for years. I slept on a stained mattress on the concrete floor directly next to a loudly humming server rack. I worked 18-hour days, completely fueled by cheap, bitter coffee and the terrified, haunting memory of counting quarters at that scratched kitchen table. I was incredibly scared of failing, but I was infinitely more terrified of going back to the miserable life of poverty. Slowly, quietly, the company began to grow. We secured one major contract, then another. By the time I turned 30, Veer Systems had secretly become a massive monster in the tech world. We were not a flashy consumer app that teenagers downloaded on their phones. We built the ultra-secure back-end systems that major financial institutions, commercial banks, and global credit card companies relied on to process millions of sensitive transactions every single day. If a major bank approved a massive commercial real estate loan, there was a very high probability my proprietary software was routing and securing that data. But I made a deliberate, highly conscious choice early on to stay entirely out of the public spotlight. I structured the main holding company with incredibly complex layers of LLCs and offshore shell corporations. I did not want my face on the glossy cover of business magazines. I did not care about fame, social climbing, or going to exclusive galas. I just wanted the absolute, ironclad security that massive amounts of money provided. I kept driving my old, 5-year-old SUV because it ran perfectly fine and I genuinely liked it. I wore plain, comfortable clothes. I did not need to wear a heavy gold Rolex to know what time it was. That was the exact man I was when I met Clara at a large technology convention in Chicago. She was attending the event with some friends. She was undeniably beautiful, yes, but she also seemed incredibly grounded and real. She laughed easily and loudly. She did not ask what I did for a living or how much money I made within the first 5 minutes of meeting me. When I finally asked her out and took her on our first date, I did not take her to a pretentious 5-star restaurant with a tasting menu. I took her to a loud, cramped, authentic pizza place downtown. She did not complain about the noise, the sticky tables, or the cheap plastic cups. She happily ate the greasy pizza with her bare hands, getting red sauce on her chin, and laughed about it. For a guy who spent his entire waking life deeply analyzing complex data structures and managing extreme corporate stress, she felt like a pure breath of fresh air. She felt like a beautiful, chaotic variable I desperately wanted in my life permanently. I knew she came from old money. You can always tell by the specific way those people carry themselves, the subtle way they expect the entire world to automatically accommodate their needs without question. But I did not care about her money. I loved her, and I truly, deeply believed she loved me for exactly who I was, not for what was currently sitting in my bank account. 2 weeks after I proposed with a modest but beautiful ring, she brought me to Connecticut to officially meet the Holloway family. I knew it was going to be an intense audition, but I had absolutely no idea the final verdict had been completely decided before I even walked through their grand front door. I remember walking into that exact same foyer 3 years ago. Beatrice stood there and looked me up and down like a piece of cheap meat. Her sharp, judging eyes scanned my off-the-rack department store suit, my slightly scuffed dress shoes, and the rough calluses on my hands from years of hard work. I could see the exact, precise moment she categorized me as vastly beneath them. After a highly tense dinner full of polite, interrogating, passive-aggressive questions from Richard about my little computer repair business, Beatrice smoothly pulled me aside. She asked me to join her alone in the family library. The room smelled intensely of old paper, leather bindings, and expensive scotch. She sat across from me in a large wingback chair, resting her hands perfectly on her lap. She used her quiet, terrifying, aristocratic voice. She told me she wanted to be perfectly honest with me because honesty was a form of respect. She said Clara was incredibly generous and trusted people too easily, which she considered severe, dangerous vulnerabilities in their world. Then she looked right at my face and said, "You are from a very different environment, Victor. You did not grow up with the heavy burden of legacy. We built this massive wealth and we aggressively guard it. Whatever your actual intentions are, I need you to know that we are always watching you. We do not tolerate opportunists." She did not ask about my dreams for the future. She did not ask about my moral character or how I treated her daughter. She looked at my Midwestern zip code, she looked at my cheap suit, and she labeled me a dirty gold digger directly to my face. I left that room, walked out into the cold, biting night air, and sat alone in my car for 20 minutes. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned completely white. I thought about my mother. I thought about the hundreds of brilliant engineers and employees who relied on my leadership and vision at Vera Systems. I deeply wanted to march back into that library, throw my massive financial portfolio on her antique desk, and crush her arrogant world right then and there. But I did not do it. I looked at Clara, who was waiting for me on the front porch, looking so incredibly hopeful and happy that we were all together. I swallowed my pride. I shoved my ego down deep. I told myself they were just highly protective parents looking out for their child. I told myself that over time, if I just kept my head down, treated their daughter like an absolute queen, and showed them consistent respect, they would eventually see the man I truly was. I thought the worst part of my journey was over. I was so incredibly wrong. The next 3 years of my marriage were an absolute, unyielding masterclass in psychological endurance and emotional abuse. To the outside world, to their country club friends, I was the incredibly lucky guy who managed to marry up into a prominent, wealthy family. Inside the high stone walls of the Holloway estate, I was a ghost. I was a walking, breathing punchline. Every single family gathering, every major holiday, every forced, excruciating Sunday dinner was exactly the same routine. Richard would hold court at the head of the table, talking loudly and aggressively about the commercial real estate market. He would intentionally throw around complex terms like capitalization rates, zoning laws, and mezzanine financing just to make sure everyone at the table knew exactly how important and wealthy he was. Julian was even worse. He was unbearable. He would boast endlessly about his latest rapid promotion at his high-end corporate wealth management firm. He would brag for hours about the high-profile billionaire clients he was supposedly managing and the massive, ungodly year-end bonuses he was expecting to receive. He would swirl his expensive scotch, look over at me with a sickening, condescending smirk, and ask how the IT repair business was going. "You guys fixing broken printers yet, Victor?" he would ask, laughing loudly at his own terrible joke while Richard chuckled along. I would just smile politely, take a slow sip of my ice water and say, "We are keeping the lights on, Julian, doing our best." He would patronize me constantly, clapping me hard on the shoulder like I was a slow, unfortunate child. He would tell me that an honest day's work was good for an honest day's pay, completely dismissing my entire existence and intellect in one breath. When Christmas came around every year, the financial disparity was aggressively insulting. Richard bought Julian a vintage Rolex watch. Beatrice bought Clara massive diamond earrings that cost more than a luxury sedan. They handed me a small, plain envelope with a $50 gift card to a chain steakhouse. It was never about the actual money. I did not need or want their money. It was the loud, clear message. The message was obvious. You are not one of us. You will never be one of us. You are a pathetic charity case we tolerate strictly for our daughter's sake. Clara genuinely tried to intervene during the first year of our marriage. She would argue with her mother in the kitchen, telling her to be much nicer to me, telling her I was a good, loving husband. But the Holloway family gravity was simply too strong, too toxic. They patiently, methodically, and ruthlessly worked on breaking her down. Aunt Margaret, Beatrice's older sister, was the absolute worst of them all. She was the family's quiet, smiling manipulator. During their afternoon HOA meetings and elite country club tea sessions, Margaret would constantly plant tiny seeds of toxic doubt. She would lean in and whisper to Clara, asking if my little computer business was actually viable. She would warn Clara that I did not seem to be making any real money, heavily hinting that Clara might have to support me forever, draining her own massive trust fund to keep my silly hobbies afloat. Over time, the poison worked its way into Clara's mind. She slowly stopped fighting them. She just wanted the conflict to end. She wanted peace. She started asking me to just absorb the insults. She would touch my arm nervously before we walked into their house and say, "Just ignore them, Victor. It's just how they are. Please don't make a scene. Just let them talk." So I absorbed it. For 3 years, I swallowed my pride. I watched my wife slowly trade her fierce loyalty to me for the easy comfort of her family's approval. But while I was sitting quietly at their dining table, letting them insult my intelligence and aggressively question my worth, I was ruthlessly conquering their world out in the corporate battlefield. Vera Systems was not just growing. It was violently devouring everything in its path. I worked side by side with my brilliant, relentless CFO, Marcus. Marcus was the only person on earth who knew the full scope of my wealth and the miserable reality of my home life. Together, we built an unstoppable empire from the shadows. We faced a massive, highly aggressive hostile takeover attempt by a guy named Silas, a ruthless tech CEO who thought he could easily bully us out of the market. Silas tried to crush my supply chain and poach my lead engineers. I did not panic. I outmaneuvered him completely. I quietly bought out his primary data center providers, cornered his debt, and forced his proud company into a humiliating fire sale. We crushed him entirely, absorbed his valuable assets, and expanded heavily into algorithmic trading infrastructure. The last public valuation of Vera Systems, buried deep in a dense financial report in the Wall Street Journal, was $2.1 billion. The entire Holloway family net worth, combining Richard's commercial properties, their stock portfolios, and the massive estate we were currently sitting in, was roughly $400 million. They were proud, loud, arrogant millionaires. I was a silent, lethal billionaire. I could have liquidated their entire existence before lunch, and it would not have even made a noticeable dent in my balance sheet. Then the ultimate beautiful irony happened. About 18 months ago, Richard's real estate firm made a massive, arrogant miscalculation on a huge commercial development project downtown. They were heavily overleveraged, and the market shifted overnight. He scrambled desperately to avoid a catastrophic foreclosure. He managed to secure a $12 million commercial credit line to refinance 3 of his crown jewel properties to keep his company afloat. The lending institution that threw him that desperately needed lifeline was Meridian Capital Partners. What Richard did not know, because he was far too arrogant to ever look past his own nose, was that exactly 2 months prior to that panic loan, Vera Systems had quietly acquired a controlling interest in Meridian Capital. I literally owned the massive debt on my father-in-law's legacy. I held the note to the Holloway empire. When Marcus brought me the final paperwork for the acquisition and I saw the Holloway loan sitting right there in the portfolio, I did not celebrate. I did not laugh or gloat. I just put the file in my heavy steel private safe in my office. I had absolutely no intention of weaponizing it. I still stubbornly held onto the desperate, foolish hope that one day, Richard would look at me, shake my hand like a real man, and respect me for being a good husband to his daughter. But then came the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal. Julian did not just mock me to my face at dinner. He actively sought to destroy my marriage and ruin my life. Julian worked in wealth management. He had a vast, shady network of corporate spies, desperate brokers, and private investigators. He dug deep into my life and found Felix. Felix was a guy I went to college with. We used to share a tiny dorm room. A few years ago, Felix was going through a brutal, messy divorce and lost his corporate job. He called me crying hysterically, begging for help so he would not lose custody of his kids due to lack of income. I felt genuinely bad for him. I created a mid-level accounting manager position specifically for him at a tiny shell entity I used strictly for minor administrative expenses, like paying the landscaping company that mowed the lawn at our corporate office. It had absolutely zero connection to my main operating revenue. I paid him a great salary. I trusted him. Julian found Felix. He took him out to an incredibly fancy steakhouse, poured expensive drinks down his throat, and offered him a massive cash payout in exchange for dirt on me. And Felix, the guy whose kids I bought Christmas presents for, the guy I literally saved from financial ruin, sold me out without a second thought. He illegally handed Julian a fake corporate revenue report for that tiny shell LLC registered under my name. The total gross revenue listed on that document was exactly $48,000. They took that stolen, entirely out-of-context tax document. They immediately went to Gregory, their expensive lawyer. They drafted a 14-page postnuptial agreement designed to ruin me. And they invited me to Thanksgiving dinner to spring the trap. They did not just want a legal guarantee to protect Clara's inheritance. They wanted a public execution of my dignity. I thought the tension in the house could not possibly get any worse. I had no idea the storm was already raging violently outside the front doors. The long drive up to the Holloway estate that bitter November evening felt exactly like crossing an invisible, heavily guarded border into a country where I was designated an enemy combatant. It was freezing in Connecticut. The trees lining the dark highway were stripped bare of their leaves, looking like jagged black veins against the fading, bruised purple sky. Clara sat in the passenger seat of my SUV, staring blankly out the window. The silence in the car was heavy, thick, and utterly suffocating. Usually, she would complain about her mother's demands or gossip about Aunt Margaret's latest country club drama. Tonight, she said absolutely nothing. Her jaw was tight. I reached over and gently put my hand on her knee. I told her it was just dinner. 2 hours tops, I promised, and then we go back home to our quiet, peaceful life. She flinched slightly, physically pulling her leg away from my touch. She did not look at me. She just stared at the passing trees and whispered, "Yeah, 2 hours." I knew something was deeply wrong. My gut was screaming at me, setting off every alarm bell I had. But my mind could not fathom the sheer depth of the betrayal waiting for me at that dining table. We pulled up to the massive, imposing wrought iron gates of the estate. The security guard sitting inside the heated booth checked my name on his clipboard. He gave my 5-year-old SUV a look of mild, unfiltered disgust before finally pressing the button to let us in. The long driveway was a winding path of crushed white gravel that crunched loudly under the tires, announcing our arrival like a warning bell. The house itself was a sprawling stone mansion that looked less like a warm home and much more like a medieval fortress meant to keep people like me out. When we walked through the heavy oak front doors, Maria, the housekeeper, was waiting in the grand foyer. She had worked for the family for decades. She took my coat, and for a fraction of a second, she looked at me with profound, heartbreaking pity. It was a look reserved for a man walking to the gallows. She knew exactly what was about to happen. She quickly averted her eyes and hurried away down the hall. Beatrice was waiting in the hallway, wearing a tailored wool dress that cost a fortune. She offered a stiff, highly practiced smile and extended a cold hand covered in heavy diamond rings. She noted that I wore the blue suit again, calling me dependable. It was a subtle, sharp jab at my perceived lack of wardrobe and wealth. Richard walked into the foyer holding a crystal glass of amber liquid. He gave me a quick, overly firm handshake designed specifically to test my grip and assert his physical dominance. Julian appeared right behind him, looking at me with that signature arrogant smirk pasted on his face. He pointed through the window at my vehicle parked outside next to his gleaming new Porsche and made a sarcastic joke about my carbon footprint, laughing at his own brilliance. I forced a polite smile. I played the exact part of the quiet, submissive, grateful son-in-law perfectly. We moved into the formal dining room. The table was set for royalty. I took my assigned seat next to Clara, directly across from Julian. Gregory, the lawyer, sat quietly to Richard's right, meticulously organizing his briefcase. The serving staff brought out the food, carefully arranging the ornate silver bowls of steaming vegetables and the perfectly carved turkey. But nobody picked up a fork. The tension in the room was so incredibly thick you could choke on it. Richard slowly picked up his wine glass, took a slow sip and set it down. The clink of the crystal against the heavy wood table echoed loudly. He announced in a booming voice that there was a matter of family business to attend to before we ate. He nodded sharply to Gregory. Gregory reached down into his leather briefcase. He pulled out the thick stack of papers and slid them across the linen. And that brings us exactly back to the moment the trap snapped shut. The 14 pages of dense legal jargon designed to completely erase my existence and throw me into the street. The fake tax return showing $48,000 tossed aggressively onto the table by Julian, who was grinning like a hungry hyena. Beatrice bringing my dead mother into the conversation, using the woman who worked herself into an early grave as a cruel punchline to justify her snobbery. And Clara sitting there, crying silent tears, begging me to sign away my rights, admitting out loud that she knew this ambush was coming the entire 2-hour car ride over here. The air instantly left my lungs. My hands, resting out of sight under the table, curled into incredibly tight fists. My nails dug into my palms so hard I could feel the skin breaking. A cold, absolute fury settled deeply over my entire body. It was not the hot, messy, screaming anger of a young man. It was the freezing, calculated, terrifying rage of an apex predator that had just been unleashed off its leash. For 3 long years I had played their stupid game. I wore the cheap suits so I wouldn't threaten Julian's fragile ego. I smiled at Richard's relentless insults. I let Beatrice treat me like the hired help. I did it because I believed that real power was quiet. I believed in taking the high road. But looking at Clara's tear-stained face, looking at Julian's sneering grin, I realized a fundamental, undeniable truth about the world. Some people do not respect humility. They only respect power. If you let them treat you like a doormat, they will happily wipe their dirty feet on you every single day of your life. They wanted a gold digger. Fine. I was going to show them exactly what real, world-ending money looked like. I reached out for my crystal water glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip. Then I set it down perfectly in the dead center of the coaster. Every single eye at the table was glued to me. They were waiting for me to break. They were waiting for the apologies, the begging, the tears, or the angry, impotent outburst of a defeated man. I gave them nothing. I reached out and slowly picked up the heavy silver pen lying next to the contract. Richard smiled a broad, ugly smile of triumph. Beatrice relaxed her rigid posture, sinking back into her chair. Julian let out a short, victorious laugh, reaching for his wine glass. I looked at the pen. I looked at the signature line. And then, without breaking eye contact with Richard, I tossed the pen across the table. It clattered violently against Julian's wine glass, nearly shattering it, before spinning off the table and hitting the hardwood floor. I told them I was not signing it, and I reached down for my own briefcase. I reached down to the floor and grabbed the thick, heavy leather handle of my own briefcase. I lifted it up and placed it squarely right on top of their pristine, blindingly white linen tablecloth. I set it down right next to the expensive crystal water glasses and the completely untouched roasted Thanksgiving turkey. Richard immediately slammed his heavy hand flat on the table. The sterling silver cutlery rattled violently against the porcelain plates. He leaned forward, his broad face rapidly flushing a deep, angry, terrifying shade of red. He pointed a thick finger at me and ordered me to get that cheap bag off his dining table immediately. He told me in his booming, authoritative voice that I was completely out of line and that I clearly did not understand my miserable position in his house. Beatrice let out a sharp, highly theatrical gasp, clutching her heavy diamond necklace as if I had just committed a violent, unforgivable crime right in front of her eyes. Julian leaned back in his chair and laughed. It was a high, nervous, incredibly arrogant sound. He told his father to just relax and let me embarrass myself. He looked at me with pure disdain and said I was probably pulling out grocery store coupons to pay for my half of the turkey dinner. I completely ignored every single one of them. I kept my face entirely blank. I reached out and popped the heavy brass locks on my briefcase. It made 2 sharp, incredibly loud, echoing clicks. The mechanical sound cut through the thick, suffocating tension in the dining room like a butcher's knife. I reached inside and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was the exact same fake corporate revenue report Julian had so proudly tossed onto the table moments earlier. The one showing $48,000 in gross annual revenue. I held it up high in the air so every single person at that massive table could see the bold black ink. I kept my voice incredibly calm, completely devoid of any hot emotion. I looked directly into Julian's smug eyes. I told him that for a senior vice president working in high-level corporate wealth management, his due diligence was incredibly, embarrassingly sloppy. I told him that I knew exactly where he got the specific document, and I knew exactly how much he had paid for it. I watched his arrogant smirk completely falter for just a fraction of a second. A tiny, microscopic crack in his perfect, golden boy armor. I explained to the entire table that the document they were looking at was entirely real. It was not a forgery. However, I explained it belonged to a tiny, completely meaningless shell entity that I had personally set up years ago specifically to handle incredibly minor administrative expenses. I told them I used that specific LLC to pay the landscaping company that mowed the lawn and trimmed the hedges at my corporate office building. I stated clearly that the $48,000 had absolutely zero connection to my actual operating revenue, my personal salary, or my true comprehensive net worth. I saw Gregory, their expensive, highly paid family lawyer, shift very uncomfortably in his seat out of the corner of my eye. Gregory was a very smart, perceptive man. He recognized the steady, unwavering tone of a man who held absolutely all the cards. He knew a bluff when he saw one, and he knew I was not bluffing. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Julian. The room was so quiet you could hear the blood rushing in your own ears. I told Julian that I knew he had hired private investigators to track down Felix. I turned my head and explained the situation to Richard and Beatrice. I told them that Felix was an old college roommate of mine, a man who was currently facing a brutal, agonizing divorce and a terrifying, desperate custody battle over his 2 young children. A man who had recently lost his corporate job and called me in the middle of the night, crying hysterically, begging for any kind of financial help so he would not lose his kids. I told them how I had created a mid-level accounting position for Felix out of thin air, just to save his life, pay his legal bills, and keep his fractured family somewhat afloat. And then, I turned my attention back to Julian. I told him exactly how he had taken Felix to an expensive, dimly lit steakhouse downtown. I detailed how Julian had poured expensive, top-shelf liquor down Felix's throat, played on his extreme financial desperation, and offered him a massive, untraceable cash bribe. I told the room that Julian paid my friend to completely breach his strict corporate confidentiality agreement and steal this entirely useless, out-of-context tax document just to humiliate me at a family dinner. Julian's face turned completely, ghostly white. All the blood drained from his cheeks. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny it, to call me a liar, but absolutely no words came out. He looked desperately at Gregory for some kind of legal help, but the lawyer was staring intensely at the white tablecloth, completely refusing to make eye contact with him. I turned my full, undivided attention to Beatrice. She was sitting rigidly in her expensive dining chair, her cold gray eyes narrowed into tiny slits of pure, unadulterated hatred. I told her that she had made a massive, unforgivable miscalculation today. I reminded her of the cold, bitter night in the family library exactly 3 years ago when she looked at my cheap suit and called me a desperate opportunist to my face. I reminded her how she had just moments ago insulted my dead mother, a woman who worked herself into an early, tragic grave carrying heavy plates of food just to provide a basic life for me. I kept my voice incredibly low, speaking with a lethal, freezing intensity that demanded absolute silence. I told Beatrice that my mother had more dignity, more honor, more grace, and more raw human value in her worn-out, cheap waitress shoes than Beatrice had in her entire miserable, arrogant, privileged body. Beatrice gasped loudly, a harsh, scraping sound in her throat. Her hand flew up to cover her mouth in pure shock. Nobody had ever spoken to her like that in her entire life. Richard stood up violently. His heavy, carved wooden dining chair scraped incredibly loudly against the polished hardwood floor, almost tipping over backward. He pointed a thick, shaking, furious finger directly at my face. He lost all his calculated composure. He told me I was completely done. He shouted at the top of his lungs that he was going to systematically destroy me. He screamed that I would never work in this state again, and that the impending divorce would leave me completely, hopelessly bankrupt. He promised me a corporate lawsuit so vicious, so relentless, and so incredibly expensive that I would be paying his legal fees for the rest of my miserable, pathetic life. He said he would take my salary, my savings, and everything I had ever touched. I did not flinch. I stood up slowly from the table to meet his furious gaze. I did not slouch my shoulders. I stood at my full, maximum height, projecting absolute, undeniable authority across the dining room. I looked Richard dead in the eyes. I told him to save his expensive lawyer the billable hours. I told him he did not need to file the divorce papers on Monday morning, because I would happily file them myself. Clara, sitting right next to me, let out a loud, shattering, agonizing sob. She buried her face deep in her trembling hands, crying hysterically at the table. But I looked down at her, and I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sadness, no lingering affection. The woman I had deeply loved, the woman I had wanted to build a beautiful family with, was dead and gone, entirely replaced by the cowardly, self-serving stranger sitting next to me. I looked down at Clara's shaking shoulders. I told her in a perfectly calm, flat voice that she had made her final choice in the car ride over here. I told her that she knew her family was going to humiliate me. She knew they were going to threaten my entire future and my financial stability. And she consciously chose to protect her potential real estate inheritance over her own loyal husband. I told her she was exactly like them, and she deserved everything that was about to happen. Julian suddenly slammed his hand violently on the table, rattling the crystal glasses again. He was trying desperately, pathetically, to claw back some of his shattered authority. He shouted that I was a massive fraud. He yelled that I was a broke, pathetic, insecure loser trying to play the tough guy in a room full of actual winners. He screamed that he was going to call the estate security right now to throw me out into the freezing cold for criminal trespassing. He aggressively pulled his expensive smartphone out of his tailored suit pocket, waving it at me across the table like it was a lethal weapon. I did not take a single step back. I firmly stood my ground. I challenged him directly. I told him to go ahead and make the call. I told him to put the security guards on speakerphone so we could all hear them. But before he did that, I instructed him in a commanding, unwavering voice to open the web browser on his phone. Julian hesitated. His finger hovered over the screen. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape route. He spat out that he was not playing stupid games with a loser like me. I raised my voice just a fraction, just enough to completely command the massive room. I ordered him to open the browser immediately. The sudden, overwhelming, unquestionable authority in my voice made him physically freeze in his tracks. Richard growled at Julian from the head of the table. He told his son to just humor me, to let me make a complete fool of myself, so they could finally throw me out into the cold November night and be done with this miserable charade. Julian aggressively tapped his phone screen, rapidly opening his mobile web browser. He glared at me with pure, unadulterated venom. He asked me what I wanted him to search for. I instructed him very clearly. I told him to type in the exact words Vera Systems. I told him to scroll down and click on the deep dive corporate financial report published directly by the Wall Street Journal just last month regarding their latest massive corporate acquisition in the tech sector. Julian typed furiously on his screen, shaking his head in total disgust. He muttered angrily under his breath, acting like I was wasting his incredibly valuable, highly compensated time. The massive dining room went dead silent once again. The only sounds were the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and Clara's muffled, pathetic sobbing into her hands. I watched Julian's eyes slowly begin to scan the bright screen of his phone. I watched carefully as the arrogant, mocking, superior smirk slowly melted completely off his face. It was rapidly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated confusion. And then, A few seconds later, absolute naked terror. He blinked hard. He brought the phone much closer to his face, squinting his eyes as if the words on the screen were written in a complex foreign language he could not decipher. His mouth opened slightly, his jaw going completely slack. The color rapidly drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly, pale, and entirely defeated. His hands began to shake violently, the phone rattling in his grip. He whispered, his voice trembling, that it was a typo. He looked around the room wildly, his eyes wide with panic, claiming it had to be a fake website, a practical joke, a scam I had paid for. Richard demanded loudly to know what was going on. He leaned over the table, his thick brow furrowed in sudden, deep concern. He reached out and snatched the phone directly out of his son's trembling hand. Richard quickly adjusted his expensive reading glasses and looked down at the bright screen. I watched the exact, precise moment Richard Holloway's entire reality completely shattered into a million pieces. It was truly fascinating to witness firsthand. First, his brow furrowed in deep, aggressive annoyance. Then, his eyes widened to the size of saucers. Then, all the color drained out of his broad face, starting from his thick neck and moving upward until he looked exactly like a pale wax figure in a museum. Richard's voice cracked horribly. He cleared his throat and tried desperately to speak. He read aloud, his voice shaking, that Veer Systems was recently valued at $2.1 billion by independent financial analysts. And then he swallowed hard and read the name of the sole founder, the active CEO, and the majority shareholder of the entire massive empire. My name. Beatrice let out a sharp, dismissive, high-pitched laugh. It sounded incredibly brittle, panicked, and completely unhinged from reality. She told Richard not to be ridiculous, loudly claiming I must have paid a cheap hacker to put a fake news article on the internet just to scare them. Richard stared blankly at the screen, completely and utterly lost. He whispered, his voice hollow, that it was the actual verified Wall Street Journal website. He slowly looked up at me, his eyes wide with a complex mixture of absolute horror and complete disbelief. He asked me, his voice barely above a whisper, how it was mathematically possible. I looked at him with eyes as cold and hard as winter ice. I told him I founded the company when I was exactly 24 years old, working out of a freezing garage. I told him my true net worth made his entire commercial real estate portfolio look like loose pocket change found in the couch cushions. I reached down and picked up the 14-page postnuptial agreement they had so proudly placed in front of me. I held it high up in the air. I told Richard the first completely understood exactly why he had this insulting garbage drawn up. He genuinely thought the financial math was simple. He thought I was a desperate guy who had absolutely everything to gain and absolutely nothing to offer his precious daughter. He looked at my cheap, off-the-rack suit and my old, reliable SUV, and he made a permanent, catastrophic calculation. I dropped the heavy paper back onto the table. It landed with a dull, heavy, final thud. I told Richard his math was fundamentally, fatally wrong. I told him that I knew his total family net worth was roughly $400 million. I acknowledged that it was a respectable number for a local businessman. But then I leaned in closer across the table, locking eyes with him, and told him that, in my specific world, $400 million was just a minor rounding error. I thought the look of total, absolute defeat on their faces was the peak of the evening. I thought breaking their pride would be enough. I was so incredibly wrong. The real, devastating storm was just about to hit their dining room. The massive dining room was completely paralyzed. Felt like time had entirely stopped moving. Clara was staring up at me, her mouth hanging slightly open, fresh tears completely frozen on her pale, flawless cheeks. She looked at me like I was a complete, terrifying stranger who had just broken into her home. And in that specific moment, I truly was a stranger to her. The submissive, quiet, overly accommodating husband she thought she knew, the man she thought she could easily control and throw under the bus, was dead and gone forever. Julian suddenly slammed both of his hands violently on the table, rattling the silverware. He was desperately, pathetically trying to claw back some of his completely shattered authority. His voice was incredibly shrill and panicked, echoing loudly off the high ceilings. He shouted that it was a massive, elaborate trick. He aggressively accused me of running a massive Ponzi scheme, calling me a criminal. He yelled that nobody on earth makes that kind of unbelievable money without leaving a massive, highly visible public trail. He screamed that he worked in high-level corporate finance, that he knew exactly how the wealthy world worked, and that I was definitely going to federal prison for fraud. I looked at him and nodded in complete agreement. I kept my voice perfectly calm. I told him he did indeed work in finance, and he should know better than anyone how financial traps actually work. I reached down into my open leather briefcase and pulled out a single, crisp, heavily redacted manila folder. I slid it smoothly across the long table directly toward Julian. Then, I shifted my cold gaze back to Richard, who was still staring at me like he had just seen a ghost. I told him that exactly 18 months ago, his commercial real estate firm took out a massive, highly risky $12 million credit line. I noted that he did this to urgently refinance 3 of his major downtown commercial properties to avoid a massive, embarrassing public foreclosure. I stated very clearly that the specific lending institution he used to save his failing business was Meridian Capital Partners. Richard swallowed incredibly hard. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously. He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with creeping, icy dread. He asked me, his voice shaking, what my point was. I told him that in November of last year, Vera Systems quietly and aggressively acquired a complete controlling interest in Meridian Capital Partners. I let those heavy words hang in the dead, silent air of the dining room for a long moment. I watched his brain try to process the catastrophic information. Then, I explained the brutal reality of his current situation. I told him that as a direct result of that specific corporate acquisition, I personally, legally held the actual note on his massive commercial credit line. Richard physically recoiled. He pushed himself violently back in his heavy dining chair, desperately trying to put physical distance between himself and the table, as if the information itself could physically burn him. I kept my voice absolutely merciless and completely flat. I told him that his vital credit line was in technical default as of exactly 30 days ago. I informed him that his accounting department had missed the critical balloon payment. Under the incredibly strict, ironclad terms of the loan agreement he personally signed, I had the absolute, undeniable legal right to call the entire massive loan due immediately. I looked him dead in his terrified eyes. I promised him that if he could not pay the full $12 million in pure, liquid cash by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, my corporate lawyers would aggressively seize the 3 massive commercial properties he foolishly put up as collateral. Richard gasped loudly for air, his broad chest heaving in panic. He completely lost his mind. He stammered that I could not do that. He pleaded, his voice breaking, that those specific properties were the absolute financial anchor of his entire real estate portfolio. He openly admitted, right in front of his family, that if I took those buildings, his whole company would instantly collapse, triggering massive, unstoppable defaults on every single other loan he had with every other bank. He was staring directly down the terrifying barrel of total, irreversible financial ruin. I told him to sit down and shut his mouth. The authority in my voice was so absolute, so incredibly heavy and demanding, that Richard Holloway, a proud man who had aggressively commanded corporate boardrooms for over 40 years, actually sank back into his chair like a terrified, disciplined child. I looked at his pale face. I told him I was not calling the loan due tomorrow. I told him I had absolutely no interest in his dirty money or in purposely destabilizing his fragile company just for fun. I told him I simply wanted every single arrogant person sitting at this table to finally understand exactly what the actual real-world power dynamic in this room looked like. I wanted them to know deep in their bones that I held their entire family legacy, their wealth, and their social standing directly in the palm of my hand. Then, I slowly turned my absolute, undivided attention back to Julian. Julian was sweating profusely now. Actual, large beads of sweat were forming rapidly on his forehead and rolling down his pale cheeks, soaking the collar of his expensive custom shirt. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a tall building. I told Julian that since we were so heavily focused on corporate due diligence and legal investigations tonight, We needed to have a very serious conversation about the private offshore trading account he had been secretly running through his wealth management firm. Julian's head snapped up violently. His eyes were incredibly wide with pure, unadulterated, primal panic. He whispered for me to stop talking. He begged me to shut up. I did not stop. I exposed him completely, stripping away every layer of his arrogant facade. I told the entire room that Julian managed a highly secretive private fund for 3 ultra-high net worth clients. Over the last 6 months, I explained, that specific offshore account made a series of highly aggressive, perfectly timed stock trades on a mid-sized pharmaceutical company. They made these massive trades exactly 3 days before the company's FDA filing timeline was publicly announced to the general market. Gregory, the family lawyer, suddenly sat up very, very straight in his chair. He stopped breathing. He knew exactly what I was talking about. Trading ahead of an unannounced FDA filing using privileged information is a massive, highly illegal federal crime carrying severe prison time. I explained calmly that the direct source of Julian's illegal inside information was a corrupt contact he had at Strickland Financial. I detailed exactly how Julian had paid this contact a massive, untraceable cash bribe under the table to leak the confidential filing timeline so his wealthy clients could make millions illegally. Julian choked out a sob. He yelled that I was lying. He desperately, pathetically claimed I had absolutely no proof, that I was just making things up out of thin air to scare them because my feelings were hurt. I softly, coldly informed him that Strickland Financial was fully acquired by one of my subsidiary tech companies back in late September. When we took over their servers, their internal corporate communications, their massive server logs, and all their deleted employee emails were all immediately subjected to my company's aggressive, deep-dive compliance review. I looked Julian dead in the eye and told him we found the deleted emails. We found the heavily encrypted digital wire transfers from his offshore account to his contact. We found absolutely everything. There was no place left to hide. Beatrice suddenly screamed. She grabbed Richard's arm, digging her manicured nails into his suit jacket, hysterically begging him to make me stop talking, to make me leave the house. I completely ignored her screaming. I looked directly at Julian and delivered the final, fatal, life-ending blow. I told him that I had officially forwarded the complete, unredacted digital file, including all of his email correspondence, the illegal transaction history, and the IP logs, directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission's Federal Whistleblower Division exactly 6 days ago. The silence that immediately followed my words was not just quiet. It was the distinct, terrifying sound of a man's life completely ending. Julian opened his mouth, but no words came out. His jaw just worked up and down silently. He looked at his father, pleading for help. He looked at his mother. Then, very slowly, he looked past me, toward the large, beautiful front windows of the formal dining room. The heavy, expensive velvet drapes were pulled back for the evening. Through the thick glass, we could clearly see the long, dark, gravel driveway leading up to the estate. Moving slowly, methodically up that gravel path were 2 sets of bright, aggressive headlights piercing the November darkness. I looked out the window. I turned back to Julian and told him that the federal compliance team had officially arrived. 2 massive, black, unmarked SUVs pulled aggressively up to the front of the house, parking at sharp, blocking angles to completely seal off the driveway. Several men and women wearing dark suits and tactical windbreakers stepped out into the freezing cold night air. Beatrice completely shattered into a million pieces. She stood up violently, her heavy dining chair crashing loudly to the hardwood floor behind her. She screamed at the top of her lungs that I could not do this in her home, in her prestigious neighborhood. She screamed wildly about her family's pristine legacy, demanding Richard pick up his phone and call the state governor immediately to stop this outrage. I explained to her, remaining perfectly calm over her hysterical screaming, that because my company now officially owned the corporate entity that facilitated Julian's massive federal crime, I was legally, strictly obligated by federal law to report it immediately to avoid a massive corporate lawsuit and criminal complicity charges for my own company. I told Julian he should actually be on his knees thanking me for arranging this initial federal interview at his private house, instead of letting the FBI humiliate him by dragging him out of his Wall Street office in handcuffs in front of all his colleagues and the national media. The heavy front doorbell rang. It was a loud, melodic, echoing chime that bounced through the massive stone house. To the Holloway family, it sounded exactly like a funeral bell tolling for their entire legacy. I calmly stood up from the table. I slowly buttoned my expensive, custom-tailored suit jacket. I looked around the room and told them all very clearly that I did not engineer this dinner. I did not ask for this vicious ambush. I did not force them to act this way. They chose to put that insulting document next to my plate. They consciously chose to insult my dead mother. They chose to treat me like garbage. I just came fully prepared to defend myself. Maria, the elderly housekeeper, walked incredibly nervously into the dining room. Her hands were shaking. She quietly, fearfully announced that federal agents were standing at the front door demanding entry with a warrant for Julian Holloway. I looked at Maria and told her to let them in. Agent Harrison, a tall, incredibly imposing man wearing a dark overcoat, walked briskly into the dining room holding a gold federal badge high in the air. 2 other armed agents flanked him. He looked around the room and loudly asked for Julian. Julian slowly, mechanically stood up. He did not say a single word. He did not fight. He was completely, utterly broken. The agents moved in swiftly, turned him around roughly, and placed him in heavy, cold steel handcuffs right there in the middle of the formal dining room, right next to the untouched Thanksgiving turkey. The metal clicked incredibly loudly, sealing his fate. Beatrice collapsed entirely onto the hardwood floor, sobbing hysterically, screaming her son's name over and over again. Richard just sat frozen at the head of the table, staring completely blankly at the far wall. He was realizing in real time that his massive real estate empire was entirely at my mercy. His favorite son was going to federal prison for years, and his untouchable pride was completely, permanently shattered. I picked up my briefcase from the table. Clara suddenly jumped up aggressively from her chair and ran around the large table. She grabbed my arm forcefully, her manicured fingers digging deep into my suit jacket. Her face was completely stained with expensive makeup and bitter, desperate tears. She begged me not to leave. She cried loudly that we could somehow fix this, that she deeply loved me, that we could just go home to our apartment and forget all of this ever happened. I stopped walking. I looked down at her hands clutching my jacket. I looked deeply into her panicked, selfish eyes. I asked her, my voice incredibly soft, if she really didn't know it was going to be exactly like this. I told her she knew full well they were going to brutally humiliate me. She knew they were going to force me to sign away my entire future and my financial rights. I told her the absolute truth. She was not sorry they did it. She was just deeply, desperately sorry that they lost the game. I firmly, intentionally peeled her fingers off my jacket one by one. I stepped back from her. I looked at Clara, then at Richard, and finally at Beatrice sobbing on the floor. I told them all that I never hid from them. I was right there, standing in front of them the whole time. They just never bothered to look past their own blinding arrogance. I turned around and walked purposefully out of the dining room. I walked through the grand foyer, leaving the screaming and crying behind me. I pushed open the heavy oak front doors and stepped out into the freezing November air. At the very end of the long gravel driveway, waiting just outside the open iron gates, was a massive, gleaming black Rolls-Royce Phantom. My personal driver and head of security, Winston, was standing by the open rear door. He saw me approaching and gave a slight, respectful nod. I stepped into the warm, incredibly quiet, luxurious interior of the car. I told Winston to take me home. I did not feel a massive, euphoric rush of joy or petty triumph. I just felt a profound, beautiful, incredibly heavy sense of absolute relief. The heavy, exhausting burden of pretending to be someone lesser was finally, permanently gone. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. 6 months passed. It is absolutely incredible and somewhat terrifying how much a landscape can radically change in just 6 short months when you finally decide to completely alter the trajectory of your life and aggressively cut out the toxic, dead weight holding you down. I was standing by the massive, floor-to-ceiling glass windows in my sprawling corner office on the top floor of the Veer Systems corporate headquarters. The view of the downtown city skyline was absolutely incredible. The bright morning sun was reflecting brilliantly off the surrounding glass towers, painting the entire busy city below in a warm, glowing gold. I took a deep breath, feeling a level of peace I hadn't felt in over 3 years. The heavy, polished wooden door to my office opened smoothly, and Marcus, my brilliant chief financial officer, walked in carrying a digital tablet loaded with our quarterly reports. Marcus was the guy who had been with me since the freezing, miserable garage days. He was fiercely loyal, incredibly brilliant with numbers, and he knew exactly how to execute my vision without asking unnecessary questions. He dropped comfortably into one of the expensive leather chairs across from my desk and immediately started giving me the quarterly financial numbers. He proudly announced that the massive Meridian capital integration was officially complete, and we were showing a massive 12% increase in overall operating revenue across the entire subsidiary board. We were growing faster than ever before. I turned away from the massive window, walked over to my desk, and asked him for a detailed update on the Holloway situation. I needed to know exactly where the fallout had landed. Marcus sighed heavily and scrolled down on his digital tablet. He looked up at me and told me it was incredibly ugly, worse than even we had projected. Richard Holloway had officially and publicly filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection just the day before. Marcus explained the brutal financial mechanics of the collapse. Without the Meridian Capital credit line to save his over-leveraged assets, and with the devastatingly bad, highly publicized press stemming from Julian's shocking federal arrest, Richard's other commercial lenders got incredibly spooked. The banks panicked. They universally triggered the cross-collateralization clauses in his contracts and aggressively called their massive notes due immediately. Richard couldn't pay. The entire commercial real estate firm went into immediate receivership. He was being forcibly liquidated by the courts to pay off his massive debts to avoid total personal ruin. Marcus informed me, his voice totally neutral, that the bankruptcy court was officially putting the massive Connecticut estate, the very house where they tried to destroy me, on the open market next week to satisfy the angry creditors. I nodded slowly, digesting the information. I did not smile. I did not gloat. It was just business, pure and simple. Actions have severe, life-altering consequences, especially when you build your entire life and your fragile ego on a shaky foundation of extreme arrogance and bad debt. I asked Marcus about Felix. I needed to know what happened to the man who smiled in my face and then sold me out for a quick, dirty payday. Marcus tapped his tablet. He told me that Julian's elite wealth management firm had aggressively fired Felix the very morning after the Thanksgiving dinner. When the SEC started digging aggressively into Julian's offshore files and seizing corporate servers, they easily found all the illegal, encrypted emails Felix had sent Julian containing my stolen, fake tax documents. Because Felix had severely and intentionally breached his ironclad corporate confidentiality agreement with my company, our aggressive legal team sent a massive, highly publicized warning letter to every major accounting and financial firm in the entire tri-state area. Felix was completely, permanently blacklisted from the corporate world. Nobody would touch him. Marcus told me that Felix was currently working brutal, exhausting night shifts driving a forklift at a massive retail fulfillment warehouse, just trying desperately to pay his rent and fight for partial custody of his kids. I told Marcus to keep a close, permanent eye on him and ensure he never got anywhere near our secure systems, or anyone I cared about, ever again. At exactly 10 o'clock that morning, I walked out of my office and down the long hallway into the large, glass-walled executive conference room. My personal lawyer, Gregory. Not their Gregory, but my own brilliant, aggressive legal counsel, was already sitting at the long mahogany table, organizing thick stacks of documents. Sitting directly across from him, looking incredibly small in the large leather chair, was Clara and her newly hired divorce attorney. Clara looked entirely, shockingly different. She was not wearing the expensive, tailored designer clothes she used to flaunt at the country club. Her hair was not perfectly styled by an expensive salon. She looked incredibly tired, deeply worn down, and visibly aged. The brutal, unrelenting stress of the last 6 months had taken a massive, physical toll on her. Her favorite brother was currently sitting in a federal prison cell awaiting a very long sentence. Her arrogant father had lost his entire fortune, his massive company, and his insufferable pride. Her mother, Beatrice, had fallen into a deep, dark, reclusive depression, absolutely unable to show her face at the country club or face her judgmental high society friends. The fake, heavily protected, luxurious bubble Clara had comfortably lived in her entire life had violently burst, leaving her with absolutely nothing. I sat down calmly across from her. She physically could not bring herself to meet my eyes. She just stared blankly at the polished wood of the table. My lawyer, Gregory, slid a crisp, thin, incredibly straightforward folder across the table toward Clara's attorney. It was not 14 pages of aggressive threats, complex clauses, and cruel demands. It was a standard, clean, legally binding divorce settlement. My lawyer looked directly at Clara's attorney and stated the legal facts incredibly clearly. He explained, with absolutely no room for negotiation, that I was under absolutely no legal obligation whatsoever to provide any form of spousal support or alimony. He cited the brevity of the marriage and the ironclad legal fact that all my massive assets were acquired completely prior to the union and securely held under the Vera corporate holding structure. Furthermore, he noted, because her family's company was in Chapter 11 bankruptcy, she had absolutely no trust fund or inheritance left to fall back on. She was completely legally broke. However, my lawyer continued, his voice softening just a fraction. He stated that I had personally authorized a massive, one-time severance payment of $500,000, tax-free, to Clara. He noted it was more than enough cash to buy a modest, comfortable condo in a safe suburban neighborhood, buy a reliable car, and start her life over completely from scratch. Clara's head snapped up so fast I thought she might hurt her neck. She looked at me, her red, tired eyes wide with absolute, genuine shock and confusion. $50,000 was exactly what her arrogant family had originally offered me to walk away with absolutely nothing and keep my mouth shut. I was freely, voluntarily giving her $500,000 in pure liquid cash. I want to be incredibly clear with you. I was not doing it because I legally owed her anything. I was certainly not doing it because I still loved her or wanted her back. I was doing it because I am fundamentally, deeply not them. I refuse to become the monster that tried to destroy me. I do not kick desperate, broken people when they are completely destroyed and actively bleeding on the ground. I strongly believe in showing mercy, but I only offer it from a position of absolute, undeniable, unshakable strength. Clara whispered my name, her voice breaking into quiet, pathetic sobs. She told me I did not have to do this. She openly admitted, tears rolling down her cheeks, that she did not deserve my kindness or my money after what she had allowed her family to do to me. I looked at her gently, but with zero lingering emotional attachment. My heart was completely closed to her. I told her very honestly that I knew she didn't deserve it, but I told her she was going to desperately need it to survive in the real world. I told her to take the money, buy a quiet place, get a job, and finally figure out exactly who she was without her toxic parents whispering poison into her ear every single day. I wished her a good life. She reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the heavy pen provided by her lawyer. Her hand was shaking violently, just exactly like it had been at the Thanksgiving table 6 months ago. But this time she didn't hesitate. She didn't look to her parents for permission. She signed her name on the dotted line, legally ending our marriage. She pushed the paper back across the table, stood up slowly, and walked out of the conference room without looking back. That was the absolute last time I ever saw her. When I sit alone in my quiet office now, late at night, and look back on that freezing November evening, the night I confidently slid my own heavy briefcase across that massive dining room table and systematically, ruthlessly dismantled their arrogant, fake empire, I realize a profound, life-altering truth. It was never actually about the money. The money was simply a tool, a mechanism of defense, a shield I built to protect myself from a cruel world. The absolute core of everything that happened in that house, and everything I did to survive, was about absolute respect. It was about deeply knowing your own intrinsic, undeniable value when the entire world is aggressively trying to tell you that you are completely worthless. The Holloway family truly, genuinely believed that their exclusive Connecticut zip code, their massive generational trust funds, and their elite country club memberships automatically made them superior human beings. They genuinely thought they could type up a 14-page piece of paper, slide it across a linen tablecloth, and permanently erase my human dignity. They wanted me to bow my head, accept my pathetic place at the absolute bottom of their twisted hierarchy, and be grateful for the miserable scraps they threw my way. But I am here to tell you that true, lasting power does not ever come from a trust fund you did absolutely nothing to earn. True power comes directly from the dirt. It comes from surviving the absolute worst, most agonizing days of your life when you have nothing to eat, nowhere to turn, and nobody coming to save you. It comes from staying up until 3 in the morning, your eyes burning, building something massive with your own 2 bare hands while everyone else in the world is sleeping comfortably. Richard and Beatrice looked at me across that table, and they only saw a guy in a cheap, off-the-rack blue suit. They were completely blinded by their own extreme toxic privilege. They should have looked deeper. They should have seen the guy who survived the grueling, exhausting midnight shifts at the diner with his hardworking mother. They should have seen the guy who survived the terrifyingly empty bank accounts, the terrifying leaps of faith, and the crushing, suffocating pressure of building a tech empire from a freezing, unheated garage. They thought they were hunting a helpless, stupid sheep, completely unaware they had just invited a starving, patient wolf directly into their dining room. Thank you so much for sticking around and listening to my entire story today. I know it was an incredibly long, intense journey, but it is a vital, defining chapter of my life that fundamentally changed exactly how I view the world, how I view wealth, and how I view the people in it. I truly, deeply hope this resonated with you in some meaningful way. We live in a society that constantly, relentlessly tries to put a cheap, arbitrary price tag on our human worth. People will judge you based on what kind of car you drive, what designer brand of clothes you wear, or what rough neighborhood you came from. Do not ever let anyone hand you a piece of paper or look at your bank account and tell you what your life amounts to. Your true value is built in the dark, through your fierce resilience, your unbreakable character, and your stubborn refusal to quit when things get incredibly hard. Have you ever found yourself in a similar, incredibly toxic situation? Have you ever had to sit across a table from arrogant, cruel people who constantly underestimated you, only to finally show them exactly what you are really made of? Have you ever had to draw a massive, permanent, painful boundary with your own family or in-laws just to protect your own peace and sanity? Share your story in the comments section below. I read every single one of them, and your incredible stories inspire me to keep going and keep sharing. Now, if you made it all the way to this exact moment, to the very end of this video, you are part of a very exclusive, incredibly small group. You are part of what I proudly call the 1% Club. I want you to go down to the comments section right now and type the letter W. W stands for winner. That is our secret community code. When I see that W in the comments, I know you are someone who deeply appreciates the tough journey, someone who stays fiercely loyal until the very end, and someone who inherently understands that the absolute best revenge in this cruel world is simply massive, undeniable, quiet success. Please help me out by liking the video and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next journey. Until then, keep building your empire, keep working incredibly hard in silence, and never ever let them see you coming.